Hello once again, and welcome to Political Dharma. I'm Alan Zundel, and today is a continuation of last week's episode about my reactions to Marxism. Today I'm going to talk about my attitude towards Marx's ideas in the present time. Why talk about Marx at all? Well, the main reason is that in 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had all these people talking about how socialism was done as an ideology, that capitalism had demonstrated that it was the best possible economic system, and therefore we needed to make sure we made the best possible form of capitalism the standard for the entire world. There were political figures and intellectual figures making those kind of claims that the story was over, capitalism had won. But in 2008, just about how long from 1991? That's not even 20 years. As you know, the financial system worldwide just about collapsed. And this was the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Not that there hadn't been crises in between. And so people went back, by people I mean mainly intellectuals with some inclination to do that, began going back to Karl Marx as the great prophet of recurring crises in the capitalist economy, which would eventually lead to socialism. So a renewal of interest in Karl Marx after the 2008 crash. And by the way, we may be on the verge of something similar, because as I am recording this, the news in the last week or so has been the financial instability of the system worldwide again because of the collapse of a bank, similar to what happened back in 2008. You had a mid-sized bank collapsing, and then another one being taken over by the government, and then some others in shaky condition and spreading to banks around the world. Now, today I saw headlines that major banks were trying to prop up the system, as well as the government and the Federal Reserve. Anywho, there was a big collapse in 2008, a financial crisis, which may be recurring in a kind of echo today. And some intellectuals went back to Karl Marx. Now, I have here with me 3 books that I got from my public library, which is a good library. They have a lot of good selections. It's one of the best public libraries I've ever come across in my long life of visiting libraries. And 3 books on Karl Marx, not just biographies, but intellectual biographies that are meant to put him in perspective of the ideas of his time and how he responded to them, and the evolution of his thought over time, and the conditions, political and economic conditions, that he lived within in order to more fully understand Marx and the different ideas he presented in his various writings. So I have, and these are all big, thick books. Karl Marx, A 19th Century Life by Jonathan Sperber. This was published in 2013. I read this a couple of years ago, pulled it out again because I might want to go through it once more. And we have another one of similar, I mean, look at the size of this book. The first one that I raised is around 600 pages. The second one, Karl Marx, Greatness and Illusion by Gareth Stedman Jones. I am currently working my way through that. It was published in 2016, and this is a good, another about 600 pages or so. And finally, this one that I hadn't been aware of before, is A World to Win, The Life and Works of Karl Marx by Sven Erik Liedman. This was published in 2018. Once again, a very big, thick book, over 600 pages, including the notes. So a lot of interest on the part of intellectuals, on the part of academics, to go back to Marx's writings and try to understand them more thoroughly, what he got right, what he may have got wrong, how he came to his ideas, what we can learn from him. That seems to be the project. Then right after that, when Bernie Sanders ran for president as a Democratic Socialist, a lot of younger people in particular became attracted to the label of socialism. And when Bernie had his 2 unsuccessful runs for presidency, people started looking around. Well, what is the next step? What do we know about socialism from the past and why it has or has not worked? oh, this version of socialism where you try to take over, build a major party that can take power and do things for people. This has gone on before. What can we learn from those? And so a lot of ferment around the idea of socialism, which moved people who wanted to go beyond what Bernie Sanders was proposing, his strategy, and maybe even his aims, who wanted to think beyond that, started looking at the history of socialism. And there you are bound to encounter the ideas of Karl Marx. You just can't get away from them. In joining the DSA, one of the things that I noticed first off was there were people who were versed in Marxism who were making the case for that as a way to think. It's kind of taken for granted. People don't even realize these ideas were associated with Karl Marx necessarily. They kind of assume, well, this is what socialism is, this set of ideas, these expectations, these prescriptions for action. They assume it's pretty well established scientifically somehow in socialism by Marx and other writers, and therefore we should go hit the books again and do what they asked us to. It's kind of a going back to the original sources because you think there's something there that you need to learn. So all that's to the good, I think, to revisit Marx in the face of these recurrent capitalist crises that have been and still are undergoing. And today, I'm going to turn to what was regarded as a kind of popular introduction to the ideas of Marx, which was written by his close colleague, Friedrich Engels. Marx himself, he died around 1883, I think it was in 1883, but just previous to that, in about 1867, he published the first volume of his major work, Das Kapital, Capital in English, big volume 2, very difficult to read, and he had a second volume and then a third volume which came out after his death, after Engels had edited it. So you have these 3 big volumes of very difficult to get through in a sense, especially the first volume. And Engels was worried that very few working people would actually take the time or have the time to read through all these volumes, let alone understand them. So he urged Marx to create a short, popular introduction to these ideas. And Marx said, well, I trust you to do it, put it back on Engels' shoulders. So Engels came up with a short introduction. This was called Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. He pulled out a few chapters of something that he had written a few years earlier and used them as the basis for this small pamphlet, or as we now have it, a very short book. So I'm going to go into that and run through some of the ideas about it and talk about how these ideas still stack up, at least in my view. That is where I'm heading today, and that's what I'm going to do. So, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. What's the argument in this? It's divided into 3 parts, and I do recommend it for reading. It's very short and very illuminative, very informative. May take a few readings and some thought and discussion with other people to fully understand it, but it's worth your time, particularly if you're interested in these types of subjects. So part 1, he is talking, Engels in his part 1 of this book is discussing the early socialists, people who first began to try to apply, who began to see the problems in early capitalism and develops plans for how to rectify social division and conflict and the problems of poverty and the rest. And the idea was that these people who came just before Marx, like they were in the early 1800s, Marx was born around 1818, so Marx became an adult in the mid-century. So these people, these socialists who were there before Marx, proposed a lot of different ideas, and Engels discusses in brief some of those ideas, where they got it right and where they got it wrong, and doesn't fault them for getting some things wrong, but says in essence that the capitalist development had not progressed far enough for them to be able to see clearly how and why it was performing the way it did and had the problems it did, and where it was leading us, how it could be resolved. So they stayed in the realm of trying to create blueprints for a more harmonious society, that were not really rooted in what Engels would regard as fundamental, which is Marx's method of historical materialism or dialectical um, dialectical materialism. Different phrases there that are easily mixed up. So the first part is about that. It assesses the early socialists and why they were not able to clearly see the solution. Second part is about dialectical reasoning, which, as he explains it, I think fairly clearly. You don't have to be a disciple of Hegel to be able to understand this. The best way I could explain it here in brief is to say that dialectical reasoning has been around a long, long time, for a couple thousand years at least. Among the early Greeks, Plato was known for, you may even be aware of this, his dialogues. When he wrote philosophy, Plato didn't write like treatises on particular subjects. He wrote dialogues where he had characters discussing and debating a particular idea or concept or issue. And the idea was to say this is the proper form of reasoning, to take different sides of a subject and consider them one at a time, and then look for contradictions, look for problems in that argument, move step by step towards some kind of resolution, not a revolution, but a resolution. So this is dialectics. And according to Marx, this process of reasoning through step-by-step stages fell into the background in a certain phase of modern life when the Enlightenment was developing, and didn't return to it until Hegel. Here I could say the way of scientific reasoning early on would be more akin to if you had this, say you hadn't been aware, explorers had not yet started digging up fossils of ancient animals like dinosaurs. No knowledge of that. Go back 100 years in time and say, all you had was the Bible, which told you that God created human beings, God created all the animals of the earth. So you're assuming these are like eternal. God had the idea for a bear, created a bear. Bear is always going to be a bear. But then when you uncover fossils of animals that you did not know about previously, you see this as a process of change, that over the course of time, things that seem fixed can change quite a bit. One thing can change into another, so that instead of having, for example, birds and reptiles as separate, distinct classes of entities, you had birds evolving from reptiles and intermediate stages. So the evolutionary way of understanding natural history was counterposed to a way of understanding natural history that saw each particular aspect of life, each particular species, each particular geological formation as being, in a sense, something in itself that would always be that, whatever the specific individual cases might pass away or come to birth, but there were categories of things that were fixed. In evolutionary theory, they're not fixed. So what Marx did is he turned Hegel around, because Hegel pretty much looked for dialectical working out of ideas through history and how various forms of society embodied reasoning about how we could live together. He took this and he said it wasn't about the development of ideas through history and the counter juxtaposition of ideas one against the other. It was the development of our forces of production. That is how people worked to produce the things we need for life or the things we can enjoy in life. Growing food, making clothes, building buildings, doing art, everything else, how we produce things, how that is organized. And as those forms of production and distribution change over time, everything else changes because they are based on class divisions. So the push and pull of class interest in a particular form of production and distribution are going to create a tension that moves it in particular directions and eventually will resolve in some kind of radical change. Now, in past history, these changes were very slow. He saw them in his time, the 1800s, as moving very rapidly. Social changes very rapidly. revolutionizing the economy and politics. All this stuff was changing, technology. So he expected rapid change to continue at that pace. So where am I at? So dialectical materialism, Marx's method was one of looking at how things change over time and the tensions within a particular form of the tensions that are present that have to be resolved within a particular form of economic organization. So that's his dialectical method. And here I think he really did make his best achievement in this. Let me take a couple of ideas out of this. First of all, when he was talking about the early socialists, it was a way of saying that they had ideas about how society would be organized, but what was going to reorganize society was actually the working out of these changes of the economy, that as the capitalist economy developed further and the tensions within it changed, there would be an eventual resolution. So Marx and Engels avoided blueprints for the future, or like ideas about how socialism would ideally be organized in a perfect society or a world that we're capable of creating in the present moment. They didn't want to produce blueprints for a socialist society. What they wanted to do is demonstrate how we were moving in a particular direction, how we had gotten to where we are and where this seemed to be taking us. So they avoided blueprints. Now, 2 episodes ago, I talked about kind of blueprints of different ways that socialism could take us. Progressive socialism, market socialism, state socialism. Is that a contradiction to what Marx is doing? I don't think entirely, because I think those each represent social experiences that have already been had that we can analyze from the vantage point of the 21st century. We can look back and see examples of any of those forms of existence, kind of a raw capitalism. We can see a market socialism society. We can see the democratic socialism forms of organizing. And you can look at them and say, well, how does this work? What are the tensions within? Where is it supposed to lead to? I'll get back to that in a second. And the second section, where Marx is explaining the dialectical materialist way of thinking, and he faults Hegel for having an idealist philosophy. Now, by idealist, he doesn't mean idealistic in the sense that we generally mean it today. That is, it's expecting more of human nature than is possible, looking for some kind of perfectionism. No, he's talking about ideas precede reality, in a sense, that there are these existing ideas that are working themselves out in history, whereas really what's working itself out is material relations. But Hegel saw his own system of historical analysis as final. And here's what Engels has to say about that, that a system of natural and historical knowledge, embracing everything and final for all time, is a contradiction to the fundamental law of dialectical reasoning. He is saying that Hegel's assumption that his mode of thought was like the final answer to understanding society and where it was going and how it had developed is wrong, simply because it takes that state of knowledge as a fixed truth. Now, I want to contrast that sentence. A system of natural and historical knowledge, embracing everything, final for all time, is in conflict to the fundamental law of dialectical reasoning. 2 forms of Marxism to keep in mind here. The one form of Marxism is that which adopts dialectical materialism, that sees at any point in understanding of how society is working, that can be corrected as we learn more, that we can see things a little more clearly as events developed. We can keep going back to the drawing board, that economic events are going to move in their own way, and we look and say, how has it worked, and now where does it seem to be taking? And that is just, you're always changing. The other form of Marxism is doing what exactly Engels criticized Hegel for, which is to take Marx's system at a particular point in time, that is when he was writing his books, and think that he had solved he had come up with the answer to social problems and the resolution of them at that moment, that there was no further development to be had, and what we needed to do was go back to Marx all the time and just adopt whatever he said about things without much criticism, as though this was a closed scientific system that had reached a final solution. So bear that in mind. Two forms of Marxism. The first form of Marxism is one that sees that you can still improve and correct on whatever insights Marx had, and this would be a form of Marxism I could agree with, one that starts with the material basis of reality and how the economy is organized and what we see having happened and happening at the present moment, using that to correct whatever Marx thought. And the other form, looking to Marx as though he had formed a closed system that couldn't be improved upon, and therefore what we need to do is study Marx and use that as a kind of a Bible of what socialism means. Now, the implication of that is if you're going to be a theorist of Marxist persuasion, you got to keep learning from the history of socialism since the time of Marx. Well, how has the thinking changed? How has our experience changed? What kind of problems have come up that may have not have been expected? Obviously, things didn't go quite the way Marx expected, so there's a lot to learn from the history of that. I would not expect the average person interested in socialism that wants to do something like what can we do, where are we being led, to want to take the time to go into all of that. So I would say don't spend a lot of time studying Marx, but rather look more at the history of socialism and the history of the development of these thoughts. That's what you should be looking at. Don't get too stuck on Marxist ideas as fixed, but realize that we are currently in a time of flux where people are trying to sort out, people have more time on their hands to do this and more of a background in understanding it and the knowledge to do it, are trying to work out what we can learn from the experience in the last couple hundred years. And that's where I would focus my time more. This Socialism, Utopian and Scientific is a good introduction to Marxism. It's not the final word, but it's a good start. And from there, you can learn more about socialist history, maybe even give you some more suggestions later today. Okay, those are kind of some of the things I wanted to say about that. And the final section of the Socialism, Utopian and Scientific is one in which Engels recapitulates Marx's historical findings about the development of capitalism. And one of the things Engels has to say is that Marx's contributions to a more scientific form of socialism were two. One was explaining capitalism historically and the conditions that caused its arising, as well as the conditions that will eventually result in its displacement by a socialist system. So his contribution was that, applying his dialectical materialism to the development of capitalism and understanding how it worked. And the second one was laying bare the essential character of capitalism and the idea of surplus value. Those are his two contributions. Now, I talked a lot about the first, how things developed over time, and the rest of that third chapter is mostly, or third section, is mostly recapitulating what Marx found when he did his very painstaking research into the history of capitalism, how it developed, what happened, what are the principles of development, and what leads to these crises, what are the contradictions within capitalism that leads to these periodic crises, and why that will eventually result in capitalism being displaced, overthrown, and a new system instituted. Okay, that's good stuff to read. But near the end of that, what Engels does is he tries to lay out some predictions for how this is going to go. And I think those predictions are problematic in a number of respects. Essentially, what he predicts is that, and he saw this happening in his own time, that there's a contradiction between making production more and more rational and socialized, getting lots of people together in a form of organizations that's very carefully constructed to produce as efficiently as possible, and the way that the benefit of that production is distributed, that it is taken by capitalists rather than the people who were working to create that wealth. Here, the idea that Marx presents is one of surplus value. It's based on what's called the labor theory of value. And I think that's an area that definitely needs to change. The significance of that, okay, let's talk about that for a minute. The significance of this idea of labor theory of value and surplus value is Marx was trying to show, using the ideas of the very economists of capitalism that had already gone before him, like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and had become standard within the developing field of economics, as a matter of fact. One of the concepts was labor theory of value, and Marx wanted to use their own concept to show why capitalism is not a stable system. That is, as they are looking at the workings of capitalism and assuming, okay, we want to understand how this works, the assumption here is you want it to function very well. You want capitalism, because it's producing more wealth, to function smoothly. So they're looking at how it works from that standpoint. Marx says it doesn't function that smoothly. It's going to have these periodic crises, and I'll show you why by using your very own idea of labor theory of value. Well, that's been a point of contention ever since then. Economists, and I don't think directly in response to Marx, but economists shortly after Marx published his first volume of Das Kapital, using this idea of labor theory of value and surplus value, they started abandoning the idea of labor theory of value and saying there is no standard of value that's objective, it's all subjective, and eventually produced marginal theory of value. You don't have to understand all that. Suffice to say that the idea of labor theory of value is not well accepted either by conventional economists or by a lot of Marxist scholars. So when you hear people complain about Marxism, they will often focus on that as though if it's not a sound idea, this labor theory of value, if it's not sound, all of Marx is discredited, and therefore everything he expected to happen or tried to explain through it is invalid. That's not true. That's not necessarily true at all, because the problems of capitalism that he was explaining are clear to anyone that cares to see it. It creates wealth that's then appropriated by very few people. They pile up the wealth and they keep looking for more wealth. It drives the process, and it creates this tension between capitalists and the whole of the rest of society, who are mostly people who need to count on their labor to provide them with anything to live on. So the things that Marx had to say were visible to people other than Marx, like Proudhon, who was more or less his contemporary and a more famous socialist than Marx in the mid-1800s. He saw a lot of the same things. He saw that property, the laborers created property, yet they worked in these organizations where the capitalists appropriated all the new wealth that was being created and tried to explain it. So the labor theory of value is not necessary to see the problems of capitalism that Marx documented in his historical research. We can lay that aside as a red herring, that if you discredit the labor theory of value, you discredited all of Marx's ideas or all of Marxism. All right. Now, his other contribution, the dialectical method, here where Engels went wrong is towards the end of that section, he starts making predictions. So he's moving out of the mode of analyzing the past and how capitalism has developed and where it's at now and the tensions that seem to be pressing it toward a resolution. And he makes a prediction that they are at the moment where this transition to socialism is about to happen, and it will happen in this way, that capitalists will keep trying to organize further production in order to restrain competition and the periodic crises. And eventually, because they have control of the state, they will, through the state, take control of the means of production as the best way of organizing it on a society-wide basis. He saw this happening, or at least moving in that direction, in Germany at the time when he wrote this. the chancellor, who's like the chief executive, Otto von Bismarck, was proposing, I don't know if he proposed or actually did it, but he was proposing nationalizing the railroads. And he was not a socialist. He was a friend of the older classes, the bourgeois class, the capitalists in particular. So Engels saw this happening, the movement towards nationalizing first the railroads and probably other things as well, as a way of trying to rationalize production further. And then the expectation was that workers would see that since the state was supposed to represent them and they were agitating for the rights to have a right to vote and choose their own representatives, that would eventually lead to them saying, okay, the state is running business, but the capitalists are still profiting. We should be all profiting from this if the state represents us all, and that would be where socialism takes root. Didn't happen like that. He didn't anticipate the difficulty of workers being able to unite and exert their political will as a whole. The political question of how you bring people together in an organization and then in some sense represent the whole of them, even a large part of them, say the majority of workers being the majority of society, if they could take power, how do you get the majority of workers even together? They have to understand this process. There has to be a way of educating them. And there are a lot of ways that they can be divided and repressed that more and more have become obvious over the decades. And the forms of surveillance, oppression, and division are very highly developed in our own time, making it, putting a lot of obstacles in the way of bringing a large part of the working class together to exert their political will. And I think it shows a lack of attention to political processes, democratic political processes, which were not well developed at the time. How do you actually take a mass of people and translate what they want into some system of representation, which seems to be necessary when you're doing things on a large scale? So those political questions had not yet been faced squarely, I wouldn't say. So how do you get the working class together enough to actually do their, enact their political will, and what kind of obstacles could be placed in the way of that? They didn't quite foresee that. Another thing he didn't foresee is that when the capitalists or anyone else did use state power to take control of large businesses, you could have a new class arising or a new formation arising. We've seen this both in the form of fascism, where capitalists could use the state to take over large parts of the economy and run them in their interest. We also saw it in the Soviet Union, where the state took over the economy in a lot of ways, but the state was captured by a bureaucratic class and ran it in their own interest. A lot of reasons for understanding, a lot of reasons went into why that happened, but those are two areas where we now have to say in history, things could go in a different direction. Rather than capitalists through the state seizing entire control of the economy and running it for themselves, and then the workers seizing control of the state to get control of the means of production, you could have the state in the name of capitalists or other interests take control of property and not run it in the interest of the workers, in the forms of fascism, which we may be on the verge of here in the United States again, or in the form of state socialism, which was created because the Soviet Union ran out of other options, I think. But we can see how it misfired with the new bureaucratic class. Again, the problem is, once you have control of the means of production, how does a mass of people run it in a way that doesn't throw up a new ruling class? So it's about time to end this episode. Give you a lot to think about, probably. I hope I made some of Marxism clearer and the problems with thinking about Marxism. I want to reiterate that we should think of it as a work in progress, a method to keep progressing rather than a fixed for all time set of ideas proposed by a great thinker. Marx has been mythologized deliberately early on by his first followers in order to get people to get interested in the system and accept it. And we have that legacy with us. We have to break out of the idea this is the final word, and more that this is a method that we have to keep utilizing to look at our mistakes and go through history. Now, do I think it's inevitable that things are going to go on in roughly the direction that Marx and Engels thought? I think there's other possibilities now that we can see that they didn't see. For one thing, ecological damage can return us to a condition of scarcity where we start the process all over again. The socialist revolution in their mind is predicated on the fact that we have the means to produce enough for everybody. We may be destroying that capacity as we destroy the natural ecology. Or we could even blow ourselves up in another nuclear war. So that reduces, either eliminates the human race entirely or throws us so far back we have to start, in essence, all over again. So we're not inevitably going to proceed to socialism when those options are still on the table. Okay, so we know these are the dangers facing us right now, is to fossilize Marxism as a system instead of continuing to add and revise it. The dangers of repression from the modern state, how much they can repress workers in order to delay the resolution of the problems of capitalism, and the prospect that we might make things so bad for ourselves that we're thrown back into a condition of scarcity. Those are the three things I want to leave you with. Not pretty, but trying to find a way to move forward. I think there are ways to move forward. I'll talk about those more in upcoming episodes. Thanks for listening. Once again, you can go to politicaldharma.com if you want to find links to the YouTube videos or the podcast versions of this program. We're closing again with music from Joey Halpish and Patty Rose. Why until next time.
With ease, I see the chains are breaking. We've gained our focus. The moves we're making will prove to determine our self-worth as a passenger on the vehicle Earth.